All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Popular Music Books in Process series. As always, it's a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbart and Kimberly Mack. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab and get on the mailing list by contacting Eric. You can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's great conversation about displaced genres with Nadine Hubbs on Mexican Americans and country music and Jake Johnson on musicals far from the coasts. I regret to have to announce that next week's planned session with Mark Katz and Aline Braxton has been postponed due to a scheduling conflict. So we won't have an event next Monday, but we'll let you know on the mailing list when that's been rescheduled. But today, we're excited to welcome you to a session we're calling Little Girls, Big Voices, Voices, Agency, and Coming of Age, featuring Alexandra Apolloni talking about her recent, just coming out now, I think, book, Freedom Girls, Voicing Femininity in 1960s British Pop from Oxford University Press, and Jacqueline Warwick discussing her book in progress, Child's Play, Musical Prodigies, and the Performance of Childhood, which is under contract also with Oxford. So quick biographies on our guests today. Alexandra Apolloni is a writer, singer, and musicologist with a PhD in musicology from UCLA. Currently, she directs the Scholars as Leaders, Scholars as Learners faculty development program at Yale. Previously, she was the program and research developer at the UCLA Center for the Study of Women, And from 2019 to 2021, Alexandra served as vice president of IASPM US. And Jacqueline Warwick is professor of music at Dalhousie University, which lies on unceded Mi'kmaq territory in Eastern Canada. She is the author of 2007's Girl Groups, Girl Culture, Popular Music and Identity in the 1960s, and co-editor with Alison Adrian of 2016's Voicing Girlhood in Popular Music, Performance, Authority, Authenticity. Now, as always, during their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat sidebar.
And we should be back on now.
Great. So Jacqueline and I are each going to take about 5 or so minutes to introduce our books and the clips that we sent around in advance. And then we are going to, so I'll do my little introduction, then Jacqueline's going to ask me some questions, then we'll switch, she'll do her introduction, I'll ask her some questions. We're excited about this as an opportunity for the two of us to dialogue, and then we will open the floor to all of you. So my book, which just came out earlier in, just a couple weeks ago in October, Freedom Girls, it looks at girl singers in England in the 1960s. So kind of the women of British invasion era pop is how I think of it. And it argues that their voices played a kind of critical role in how ideas about what it meant to be a modern young woman were sort of constructed and circulated around this time. And it uses different singers for making different kinds of arguments about race and about class, and for kind of thinking through those kinds of questions. So I circulated clips of performances by Lulu and Millie Small in advance of this talk. And I think, I'm interested in putting these two singers in conversation with each other. Their stories share a lot of common threads and similarities. They're both singers who began their careers very, very young, so when they were still girls. The clips that you looked at would have been recorded when they were around the age of 15. They were both extremely virtuosic singers. Lulu still is. And both of them, their voices became the sort of nexus for a lot of anxieties about race, about gender. People projected a lot of assumptions onto their sounds, and the sounds of their voices became very closely connected with how their bodies were perceived, and how their role in rock and roll for Lulu and in ska and Jamaican pop music for Millie was understood. So to give you a bit of background about each of them, Millie Small is most well known for her recording of My Boy Lollipop, which is what you saw in that clip. That clip was from a television special called Around the Beatles that aired in 1964. And I think it's an interesting clip because you see Millie Small shot from above in a way that kind of really emphasizes the way that she was small. She's kind of cast sort of as a peer with all of the kids who are kind of clustered around her. Millie was from rural Jamaica. She was sort of handpicked by Chris Blackwell of Island Records to be the sort of ambassador of Jamaican pop music to white audiences in Britain. She had a really substantial local career in Jamaica before she became a sort of international star. And when she was kind of brought over to the UK, she was really positioned as this very young, very small, very non-threatening kind of ambassador for Black music, essentially. And her voice was a key part of that. So when you listen to her sing, you hear this vocal quality that is very strong, but it's very focused and it's very bright, and it sounds very, very young and childlike. And in kind of press from the period, you hear it described as a baby voice, you hear it described as a kind of firecracker voice. So it was this voice that people thought sounded playful, but people also thought sounded really kind of piercing and strong. So it had these kind of conflicting connotations. What's also interesting is that when Millie came to the UK, she took elocution lessons. So her singing voice, part of what was exciting about it was that it sounded different, but there was also this sort of attempt to take her speaking voice, which some people thought sounded sort of too Jamaican, and make it sound more appealing to a white audience. And so there's talk about these elocution lessons in press about her in the period. So it's this interesting kind of gesture towards like making that part of the persona that she's trying to fit in and to assimilate to British culture. You also see a lot of really sort of racialized depictions of her in the press. So there was a whole run of articles in the New Musical Express that talk about her and call her the banana tree singer and tell these stories about her being really young and, you know, climbing trees in Jamaica and singing from the top of banana trees. So these kinds of stories that are really drawing on these very colonialist tropes and kind of depicting her as this sort of like cheerful colonial other. But, you know, she had a kind of really complicated reception. Later in her life, she recorded a song called Enoch Power, which was a really powerful kind of anti-racist statement that tapped into the kind of growing white nationalist sentiment that was brewing in England in the late 60s and 70s. So I'll leave things there with Millie. Lulu is mostly known in the US as the singer of To Stir With Love, but she's had a much kind of longer and more varied career arc in England. So much like Millie, she started her career young. She was locally famous in Glasgow, where she grew up. She kind of came up singing in, you know, working men's clubs, and then eventually kind of makes the transition to singing with a rhythm and blues group. She kind of exhausted opportunities in Glasgow, and that's when she went to London to pursue a national career. And she, from the outset, has this reputation as a little girl with a big voice. And Shout is her debut single, and so that really makes clear that like the voice is kind of this key part of who Lulu is. And her voice, like Millie's, is really interesting and divisive. She's capable of these really beautiful lyrical lines. You hear her singing Shout and she can get these sort of bell-like high tones, but then she also goes into this sort of gritty part of her chest voice that sounds like almost raunchy when she kind of goes down there. And Lulu really found herself stuck in this little girl persona. And I think there's a couple of ways we can read that. One is that, you know, Lulu needed to be portrayed as childlike to kind of neutralize her voice in a way. So it was this voice that kind of evoked musical influences from Black American music. And so there was this sort of sound of racial mixing there, but portraying Lulu as this innocent girl kind of diffused some of that. At the same time, though, there's a way in which it also kind of sexualized girlhood. So you could read it in the other direction, which is that her voice kind of sexualizes her kind of girliness. And she kind of pushed back a lot against the girly image, even already in the 60s, about a year after that performance that you saw, she was quoted in the media saying she wanted to change her performing name to Louise because she thought it would be more adult. She complains a lot in articles about being seen as sort of the only virgin in London. And so kind of evoking this idea that being part of 60s rock and roll and 60s counterculture, you know, sexual expressivity is a big piece of that. And as a little girl, or somebody pigeonholed as a little girl, she felt like she was being sort of excluded. So I will leave things there and turn things over to Jacqueline.
Great. Thank you, Alexandra. It's always so wonderful to hear you talk about your work and these wonderful singers. So my first question, and I know you're going to see this coming, is about these singers and to the extent to which they become kind of trapped in girldom to a degree, and do their voices change? I mean, I know a little bit about Lulu's career, but do their voices change? I mean, there are things that happen to the voice, the female voice at adolescence, at puberty, that sort of make the sound change. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's harder to track with Millie because she kind of dropped out of the music industry by the 70s. She wasn't really performing as much anymore. There are some, so she passed away about a year ago, but before she died, her daughter had posted more recent videos of her singing on Instagram, which are still available if you look for them. And, you know, her voice already by the end of the 60s, it's like the tessitura had dropped, so she was sort of singing in a lower range. And like I said, she recorded this Enoch Power song, which is really dealing much more explicitly with politics, which is not to say that a song like My Boy Lollipop isn't also political.
For sure.
Lulu's trajectory is interesting as well. So she has not stopped performing. She still is very kind of active, and she is still as virtuosic as she was as a kid, but you can definitely hear changes in her voice. In the 70s, she experienced some kind of vocal injury.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And she talks about like really having to sort of retrain and relearn how to sing. And most recently, if you listen to her sing, I think the range has shifted a little bit, so she's not able to get the highs as much as she could as a teenager. But she still has that ability to kind of really jump octaves really kind of impressively and kind of navigate fast passages. Her most kind of recent and well-known live performances was with a tour called Here Come the Girls, and it was Lulu and Chaka Khan and Heather Small from M People, and it was a nostalgia tour. It was kind of tapping into this idea that like girl could be a sort of empowering kind of label that you could reclaim as an older woman, which is interesting given the extent to which she sort of pushed back against that when she was little.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah. And Chaka Khan, I actually saw Chaka Khan perform about 2-3 years ago, and she can't really do that high stuff anymore either. So in live performance, she has like other singers do those parts for her, which works pretty well, I think. So it's interesting that Lulu can still kind of pull that off. I mean, maybe she's changing keys or doing some stuff like that. Are you aware of that? Or
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's probably, you know, tailoring the arrangements to best showcase what she can do. Yeah. I think another kind of facet that comes out when you look at Lulu's career, there's a really specific kind of career trajectory that girl singers in England tended to follow. And you see this specifically with Cilla Black, who I think is the classic example of this. So Cilla Black, for those who don't know, was the girl singer who was represented by Brian Epstein, and was the one girl singer from Liverpool who he kind of represented along with the Beatles. And she made the move from being a recording artist to being a television variety host. And by the kind of end of her life was almost predominantly associated with kind of TV hosting. And so there's this path that a lot of these singers got pushed into that was, you know, you start as a youth-oriented pop singer and you make this move to being a kind of all-around entertainer.
Right.
And there was a moment where they were kind of trying to push Lulu down that path. And I think, it didn't stick to the same extent that it did with Cilla Black. Like she kind of had that moment in the late 60s and 70s where she was doing a lot of variety. She was doing a lot of stage performances in the 80s, but has kind of moved away from that a little bit. She was on the British version of Dancing with the Stars for a couple of seasons. So it's interesting how there's this sort of push from you're a youth-oriented rock performer into your, doing this entertainment that has a more seemingly broad audience.
Yeah, that's great. And as you know, I'm interested in how audiences respond to kind of girl performers, but also in how girl performers understand what they're doing. And so I guess it sounds like Lulu has sort of reflected and talked about what her career was like, but how do you think their early success shaped them as women? Like, what did that feel like for them?
I think a lot about how the 60s were ultimately a pretty kind of dangerous time, I think, to be a girl singer navigating the entertainment industry. And I write about this a little bit in the end of the book. Lulu has never talked about kind of being exploited in any sort of way. And she had a manager. Her manager was a woman who took on a very sort of kind of a maternal role and a sort of protective role. But, we know that there was a lot of kind of exploitation happening in the British entertainment industry. There were a number of major sex abuse cases that came to light about a decade ago. And so, I don't know, I think a lot about how that experience of navigating an industry where there's a lot of personal risk and risk of physical harm must have kind of shaped what it is like to be a singer.
Yeah, they probably both would have encountered Jimmy Savile, right?
I'm sure. Yeah, they both appeared on TV with him.
Yeah. So my last question, how did they both get into singing, and what kinds of support or pressure did they face at home?
So both of them, like I said, were kind of locally famous before they made this transition to being national and international stars. So Millie, she kind of got into performing by doing sort of local talent shows at first. And then from there, she was winning those talent shows. She started to perform as part of a duo with male singers. So they performed as Roy and Millie. And then she made the move from the kind of town where she grew up into Kingston in Jamaica, and had a pretty kind of active career before Chris Blackwell kind of sort of brought her over to the UK. And I think both with Millie and with Lulu, it's, neither of them have talked, like Millie in particular hasn't talked too much about the sort of family support there, but what's interesting is that a lot of the coverage of her from the period talks about her as part of a big family. And so I think some of that has to do with, wanting to portray these singers as sort of like ordinary girls who come from sort of humble backgrounds that other listeners could relate to. Lulu has a sort of similar kind of story that she talks about kind of growing up sort of working class in Glasgow in a poor neighborhood. She started singing kind of at local parties that her parents would host, or that kids in the neighborhood would host, and then she kind of makes this transition into sort of more public performance. She tells really interesting stories about how her father was apparently involved in sort of just kind of minor sort of petty crime, sort of black market sales of goods, but it meant that the family had more disposable income than some of their neighbors, and so they were able to afford a radio when some of their neighbors couldn't. So she talks about those kinds of little perks as something that also helped her listen to more music and be able to kind of absorb that into her vocal style. But I do really think the way both of them talk about family is so interesting, because it's, again, that attempt to kind of build a bridge, and with listeners, with potential listeners. And I think that was important in the 60s because, you know, one thing that I found again and again is this common attitude that I think is incorrect about about girl singers. And it's this attitude that they could only ever be each other's competitors. And that, you know, you could only have one girl climbing the pop charts. And that was thought to be because, you know, other girls who were the record buying public didn't want to listen to music by girls because they would see each other as each other's competitors. And so I think there's a lot of work that goes into trying to portray girl singers as, you know, we're ordinary girls, we're just like you, we're not somebody who's like competing with you for the romantic interest of boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that comes out in the voices as well, right? That it's important that they sound, you know, not like super virtuosos, right? That they're ordinary. You can sing along, you can listen to it and think like, I could be her, right? I could be part of that.
Yeah, and I think about your work like on the Shirelles and how, they have that kind of vocal sound as well. That is like, it sounds like girls.
Yeah. It's interesting that both the singers you're talking about, I hadn't really thought about this before, but they're not from sort of major cultural centers. They're both from sort of, I don't know what to make of that. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or
I think there's a way in which it sort of makes sense when we think about like rock and roll and this idea of tapping into sort of something that's different as something exciting. And so there's a way in which both of them get sort of exoticized as being, you know, not from like middle class, sort of middle class white, a middle class white upbringing. So I think there's a piece of that that's at play here as well. And then, you know, the story that comes up over and over again in like girls magazines of the period are these stories of girls from away kind of going to London and kind of experiencing this life in the big city. So I think their career arc kind of plays into that narrative too.
Cool. Yeah. Those are all the questions I prepared. But do we want to address some of the questions from the chat or save those to the end? I see heads shaking. Okay.
No. Let's save them to the end, please.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Well, then thank you, Alexandra, and I'll take over, I guess. And thanks so much for saying that about my earlier book about girl groups. That's really nice to know that you found that helpful. So right now I'm attempting to write a book called Child's Play, Musical Prodigies and the Performance of Childhood. And the main question I'm asking is, what is it that we like so much about seeing children perform? And here I really do mean children, like pre-puberty. And how do we use music to kind of train children into childhood, right? How does music work as a kind of discipline that teaches children how to be children? I'm sure we can all agree that, you know, the image of the child is used as a really powerful symbol of, you know, innocence, vulnerability, the past, family values, the future, all these kinds of things. So it's a pretty powerful symbol. And our culture industries really rely on real children to perform the work of awakening our inner child selves for adults. So, you know, we're always finding throughout history, these audiences, you know, move to tears at the prospect of little children combining musical talent and adorable innocence. And what Jane O'Connor calls the ability to appear bigger than big and smaller than small. Like, I don't know about any of you, but I am a complete sucker for children's school concerts. I'm like, you know, have to stand in the back because I'm so embarrassing. As soon as it starts, because there's nothing like it to get the waterworks going. So child performers, I think, represent the future and the past simultaneously. When a child is performing a piece of repertoire that we know, it suggests that the culture and the values that we treasure today are going to endure into another generation. And it suggests that, you know, it sort of fuses together the past and the future in really interesting ways. So these are the ideas I'm thinking about in the book broadly, and I'm not only talking about girls in this book, which is, you know, exciting for me, and also I'm not necessarily always talking about singers, but I want to talk a little bit about some little girl rockers who kind of demonstrate a twist on the idea of dad rock. This is something I've been thinking about for the past little while. I'm not taking it for granted that all of you did the reading. I did share some links ahead of time, but I can certainly post them again. And I shared a clip of the Linda Lindas performing at the Los Angeles Public Library, and also a clip of a Brazilian child called Eduarda Henklein, I think I'm pronouncing that well, who is a drummer living in Brazil. I didn't post a clip of a little girl drummer from England called Nandi Bushell. Some of you might know her. She's been involved in a kind of cute feud with Dave Grohl recently, and they've been having sort of exchanging drum solos and stuff like that. She's also appeared in quite a few commercials in the UK, including one that I find completely fascinating for a store called Argos, where she's playing the drums alongside her dad. It's not her real dad, but anyway, I'm interested in the phenomenon of children learning to be fans of the rock music that their parents love, and the apparent collapse of a generational divide, right? If we think about rock music and rock and roll music as being sort of a music of rebellion and finding your own identity and pushing against the parental structures, it's kind of interesting to see parents now training their children to be rebels in that particular way. So we see all these kind of baby John Bonhams and young Angus Youngs, and there's this sort of phenomenon of mostly Gen X dads teaching their sons to be rock rebels. And I find this really fascinating and a little bit ironic. I think about the idea of, parents, Gen X parents, I think, are sort of famously the helicopter parent generation. We are the ones who are most concerned about our children. And of course, I am a Gen X parent, so I must own that. That we are at the point now where it's difficult to even allow our children to go to the park and play by themselves. We want to kind of manage every aspect of their lives and keep them safe all the time. And I feel like this is also spilling over into managing their sort of inner journeys of self-discovery, right? That even their experience of rebellion is something that we want to curate and manage for them. So we want to teach them to be rebellious, but without ever actually experiencing any discomfort or oppression. And I find that really quite fascinating. So I've been keeping an eye on cute kids rocking out for some time now. And I've noticed more and more girls participating. Sometimes when they talk about that, how they got into it, they talk about, mummy's record collection, but mostly they talk about, my dad's guitars and, being in the car with my dad and the music he listened to. And it's clear that sharing music is a really valuable way for fathers and daughters to stay close, which is awesome. I think that's fantastic. In some of these YouTube clips and other performances, like the Nandi Bushell stuff, if you've seen any of that, you might recognize what I'm talking about, these sort of patterns where the child is often infantilized even younger than she is. And this resonates with what you were saying before, Alexandra, like with really old fashioned girls, like clothes, like very frilly dresses, sort of lacy socks and Mary Jane shoes and, big hair bows, things that most, 10-year-olds would never actually agree to wear, in my experience anyway. And then this is juxtaposed against musical material that is hyper virtuosic and hard. So with regard to little girl drummers, it's, they're all playing like Chop Suey, right, by System of a Down, like these really hard, virtuosic, demanding, gritty kind of music. And it's that contrast between like the cuter than cute and the tougher than tough that is part of the appeal of them. Really interestingly, the most popular performers, I think, are the ones who show that kind of wonder and excitement at being allowed to play. That's the thing that most of them are really, really good at, is sort of, oh, I'm so excited. I love this music, and like letting their faces light up. Some of them are very, very good at that. And this reminds me of the work of Gary Cross in his book, The Cute and the Cool, where he talks about how childhood itself gets commodified when adults become addicted to children's delight and excitement. And we keep showering them with gifts in order to get our fix of their little faces lighting up. And then when they start to get bored with our sort of excessive consumption on their behalves, we call them spoiled, right? That's the term we use, right? So there's something about the performing child that is attractive because it gives us a chance to freeze them in this state of childlike wonder and joy. So yeah, these are the things that I'm interested in thinking about. And I loved seeing the Linda Linda's performance at the LA Public Library last May. If you haven't seen it, I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's a 4-girl band. The drummer and the guitarist are sisters, and the bassist is their cousin. And then the lead guitar is a kind of family friend. Now, I don't mean to sound, dismissive, but it is true that all of their parents are in the music industry, right? So the father of the sisters is Carlos de la Garza, who's a Grammy-winning producer and sound engineer. The other dad is Martin Wong, who co-founded the culture magazine Giant Robot. So these are people who are, who know the media industry, who know how these things work, and they've been able to manage, I suspect, very good placements for this little girl band. So they opened for Bikini Kill. That was one of their first live gigs, right? They appeared in Amy Poehler's Netflix series Moxie. They've done a lot of pretty high profile things, and clearly the song they perform at the LA Public Library, Racist Sexist Boy, it's super good, is clearly modeled on the Riot Grrrl style, and it is really thrilling to watch. But I am wondering about how these children relate to their own peers, because it seems like they're performing for people my age, right? And that they're in a weird way, they're kind of a nostalgia act. So I'm wondering, I guess, about Robin James's idea that the kind of the loud, noisy feminist voice has just become a different kind of oppressive stereotype we expect women to embody. And now we expect little girls to do that too. And we kind of give them praise for that. And I wonder also about kind of the parenting styles that are going on that is managing this kind of emotional exploration and self-fashioning and kind of what's being lost. So I'll leave it there and see what kind of questions might come up.
Thank you. I love the way that you're thinking about these performances in such kind of complex and nuanced ways. I'd love to hear you say more about the nostalgia question. And I think this relates to what you were saying about, who are these, girl bands and performers performing for, whose nostalgia are they tapping into? Because it's really interesting and really striking. The Riot Grrrl connection and kind of this connection to 90s rock, and what kind of nostalgia is being communicated here? Why this? Why now?
Yeah, well, and I don't have the answers, disappointingly, and I don't know for sure with the Linda specifically who their fan base is, but certainly what I see in that clip and the other kind of placements they've done is that they're being kind of pitched towards people my age. I have no idea what kids their own age think about them. So, Svetlana Boym's book, The Future of Nostalgia, really kind of talks about the complexity of nostalgia, that it is in a way about the future as well as the past. And I feel like that is really captured in the figure of the child and the idea that the sort of, we think about like the child within and, we think about that about ourselves. And so an actual child is kind of like the embodiment of that. And I think about Sia, the singer-songwriter, and having had that little girl whose name escapes me. Maddie Ziegler, I think was her name. Yeah, that she was kind of the avatar, if you like, of Sia. That Sia saw herself as a child and kind of put this actual child out there to perform her true self. And I find that a little bit uncomfortable, but also super interesting.
Going back to kind of what you were saying about, the Lindas coming out of this milieu where they are super well connected. And then, they kind of have this experience of going viral, right? And so thinking about these young performers and the concept of sort of viral fame and, how to what extent they, have access to the kind of infrastructure to produce a video for YouTube. And so, how much do you think that having access to those kinds of resources is shaping who is able to be the sort of poster child of the rocker?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even if we think about the genre of bedroom pop, right? Who has a safe bedroom, first of all, right? Who has a space in their home where they can be safe there and write songs and articulate their ideas and record themselves, right? So yeah, it's clearly excludes a lot of people. And I find that's true with the idea of the child prodigy broadly. There's not a single child prodigy that I've learned about who didn't have some adult pushing them, which makes you think about all the incredibly talented children that, didn't have that, right? That we never saw. And And I think one thing that I'm really trying to find out more about, and I'm sorry to be so vague, your book is out and in the world, and mine is still very much in my head still. But the idea of like, what's it like when your experience of performing is like your dad with the camera, and not like Lulu and Millie Small, who like honed their craft in front of live audiences in pubs and community centers and whatnot. I think for the Lindas, like Bikini Kill was like their second gig. Right, like that, you know, they'd never played in public really before those kinds of opportunities, and I think that's extraordinary and must have such a strange impact in shaping what it's like to relate to a live audience. And then I guess thinking about like, is performing in front of a live audience really the yardstick by which we measure performers?
Yeah, I'm thinking too about like child performers who kind of become famous through reality TV as well. And, you know, you see that originally with like Star Search and those kinds of shows. And now it's all like America's Got Talent. And, you know, that's another kind of stage where the like child star is really sort of elevated. Yeah, and I don't know if you have thoughts on kind of that history and that trajectory.
Yeah, and that kind of dovetails with what you were saying about, well, more about Cilla Black, I guess, than Lulu and Millie, but the idea of like the variety show as a kind of, you mean on television now, but it as a kind of means by which certainly children and girls could perform, you know, and it's still safe, it's still respectable, right? It's still appropriate, right? It's not like, you know, trying to go out and find gigs for yourself. So it is a channel towards performance that is available, and only now it's televised. And yeah, so one of the clips I shared ahead of this of this little girl, Eduarda Henklein, performing on I think it's called Big Little Stars, but she's done all the talent shows in Latin America, as far as I can see. She's very active, and that's her performing experience.
Right. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was kind of returning us to the kind of question of voice. And, you know, whether you have thoughts about, you know, the way the Lindas sing or the way other kid rock groups sing. When I see those clips, there's something that I find really kind of compelling about them, or that I kind of see people responding to, is the way the singing can sometimes come across as like angry, but I think people also understand it as being very sort of cute. And so that sort of like angry cuteness, that sort of aesthetic that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the cuteness of an angry kitten, isn't it? Right, but it's like it's not very threatening, and it's sort of adorable. Sorry, that sounds really patronizing, but I think that is kind of part of the charm of it. And I think so what was I supposed to say, that the sort of I mean, I would like to think that the experience of tapping into that angry voice and that big growl and being loud is something that's going to be inspiring and important to them later on, and help them kind of stay connected to that. But I do also think it's become a bit of a cliche and a burden on girls and women. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's the excitement of the juxtaposition, right? The cute little girl with the bow in her hair who suddenly, you know, has this huge voice. But there is something I think kind of real about it. Like, I think little girls do always want the big dramatic torch songs, like when they're doing singing lessons or stuff. Nobody wants to sing Cosette, right? They all want to sing Eponine from Les Mis, right? They all want the big ballads and the torch songs and the drama. So there is something I think quite sincere about that I to see with little girls singing.
Well, I think those are all of my questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And so I guess we'll turn things over to Kim, who I think is gonna.
Yeah, and we have a lot of questions, which is really exciting. So I am going to ask, because we have so many, that if you ask more than one, you just pick one. So Louis went first, if you want to unmute and ask a question.
Now I have a million other questions, but that's okay. I think sorry, what was my first question? Sorry, gosh. It was back to talking about Lulu and To Sir with Love. And I just remember reading that the author of the novel hated the movie and thought that he that was defanged and got rid of all the political commentary and sort of the commentary about racist Britain, and thought that the Lulu song was the best example of that. So I was just wondering if Lulu ever talked about that.
Yeah, not that I have seen. And I think that's so interesting because I think like that song, I mean, sure, in some ways it's a love song, it's, you know, romantic, it's appealing, it's a beautiful recording. But there's so much, you know, the connotations of that song are so complex. And I feel like it opens up a whole other kind of set of issues. But yeah, she hasn't, that I know of, she hasn't talked too much about kind of the sort of response to the film. Yeah.
Okay. Carl, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm going to be the journalist here who just raises the like current events connection, and ask Alexandra about. I'm assuming she's seen Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho movie and Cilla Black's appearance there, and also the whole movie is kind of about the milieu of these '60s girl singers in Britain. So I'm just really curious what you think of the representation of it there.
Yeah, I loved that movie. I thought it was great. But it is a sort of like fantasy take on the period. But I think what I thought was really compelling about it was thinking of it as a rejoinder to this attitude that girl singers can only be each other's competitors. So for those who haven't seen the film, it follows a girl in the present day who moves to London to study fashion, and she starts having these flashbacks of a girl singer in the 60s who is trying to, you know, pursue a singing career, and, you know, immediately falls into this like underbelly where she is exploited. I think it's interesting how Sandy, who's the girl in the past, you never really see her interacting with women, but there's this connection between Sandy and Elsie, who's the girl in the present, that I think is this way of kind of just, it's almost like you get this kind of intergenerational connection that's happening, and a kind of, you know, it sort of talks back to this idea that girl singers had to be each other's competitors and couldn't find this kind of solidarity. And I also really enjoyed the way that the voices of girl singers are sort of used in the present as this sort of like thread to the past as well. I actually have a draft of an essay about the movie sitting on my computer if anyone wants it. It's just waiting. But yeah, I have lots of thoughts.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to reading that.
All right, excellent. Kira, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I'm cooking. Okay. I'm like, what's my question? I don't remember. Can you come back to me? I'll just wait. Actually, yeah.
Yeah, I can come back.
Here. I actually have another question, and this is for Jacqueline. And it's about, oh no, I've got to come back. I can't remember. Forgive me.
The suspense is killing me. Yeah.
I'll come back to you. Brian, do you want to unmute and ask yours?
Me, Brian, yes?
I skipped somebody. Sorry. Anne and then Brian.
Okay.
Sure, of course I have a million questions, but I'll ask you, Alexandra, I have like a 3-part question for you. One, I don't know if you looked at Marianne Faithfull, and I'm curious about what you think about her. And then Nico doesn't really count because her career was really in the US, I guess, more. But these stars whose either lives or voices didn't quite fit the gamine image, even though their physical appearance did. And I think Marianne particularly is sort of interesting in that way. I wondered if you had thought about that. And then I'll just throw in Shirley Bassey. Did you think about her? Just for the other side of the coin, other side of
Shirley Bassey ended up being kind of like too early to kind of fit in, so she's not in the book. But Marianne Faithfull is someone I've thought about a lot, and she, you know, I think what's so compelling about her is the vocal change that she experiences over the years. So starting out with that kind of ingenue voice and singing kind of folk pop, and then, you know, having this very public fall from grace that happens when she's like caught up in all of this sort of like sexist backlash and becomes this sort of scapegoat for, you know, everything that is wrong with rock and roll and how it spoils white womanhood, essentially. And then, you know, she experiences this dramatic vocal change. And it's, I don't know, it's interesting to me how that for her becomes this way of kind of reinventing and sort of staking a claim of a kind of authority over the music of the 60s, you know, kind of going from being like the girl singer who no one takes seriously to being someone who has experienced trauma. And then that becomes the way that she's able to be taken seriously.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Although I think in retrospect, especially after she published her memoir, the trauma she'd experienced even during her relationship with several of the Stones, you know, actually makes us hear her early work slightly different.
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
But quickly, my other question that I've just got to ask, because I'm interested in this realm, is did you think about women folk singers? Because the folk revival was happening right around that time, and there were quite a few very prominent women in that scene. I mean, obviously Sandy Denny, she comes a little later, but Anne Briggs and Linda Thompson. I just wondered if you thought about them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done as much on folk singers. I kind of actually talk about Marianne Faithfull sort of in that context a little bit. And the kind of, the ideas about kind of authenticity and naturalism that go along with like the kind of singing that's associated with the folk revival.
Oh, thank you.
Kira, do you want to go now, or do you want me to come back to you at the very end?
Still cooking.
Okay, so I'll come to you at the end. All right, Brian, do you want to unmute?
Hello, can you hear me okay? Hi, thank you so much for both of these. These are really fascinating. My question was for Jacqueline. You know, one of the things I saw is after that Linda's clip went viral, suddenly, you know, all these things wanted to be associated with it. So they are immediately signed to Epitaph Records. I don't know if you've seen the promo footage, but they're now endorsed by Fender, and Fender has put out a video of like Fender presents the Lindas, right? And there's sort of, I think, you know, there's maybe the sort of crass commercialism, woke capitalism argument here, but there's also in some ways that these young girls are being embraced in spaces in which they were, you know, historically blocked from participating in. And so I was wondering how do you interpret that moment in terms of the branding PR aspects?
Yeah, I mean, it's always double-edged, and I'm always a kind of glasses half full kind of gal. But so like, I like to see them in these spaces and getting these kinds of endorsements. And the one you didn't mention, but you're probably aware of, is they also had a song in The Chair, the Sandra Oh Netflix series, although it's with a different girl singing, so you might not have realized it was them. But yeah, they I mean, absolutely, the idea that they're sort of being supported and invited into these spaces and being kind of ambassadors for Fender. I didn't know that, but it's sure, yeah. I mean, it is commodifying their cuteness and their sassiness, but I'd like to think that they're kind of, you know, I would assume their parents are being careful with them, and yeah, I shouldn't say too much about that really, but I look at the Nandy Bushell, the girl I keep mentioning, who her mom is a mommy blogger, a Christian mom blogger, and I think is very closely involved in managing her and what kind of opportunities she has. You know, in 20 years from now, they'll all write their autobiographies and tell us what it was like. I guess we won't know till then.
Great. Okay, Eric, do you want to ask your question?
I'd be happy to. So I'll start with the specific, which is Bruno Mars as Elvis impersonator at a super young age fascinates me. And at some point I'll have to write more about Bruno Mars in general, because I just think all roads lead to Bruno in some weird fashion. But maybe we could use that tantalizing, slightly pre-YouTube person as a way of talking about a category, Jacqueline, like the sort of Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, Sammy Davis Jr., the vaudeville entertainer, that whole lineage, and how that lineage, which didn't have a generation gap necessarily in quite the same way that rock and roll presented a generation gap, but had sort of theatrical production awareness, and things like that built into it, and a sense of the stage mother and the kids and all that sort of stuff built in. It seems like that's going to be stuff you'll want to confront in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So if you prefer the tip of the iceberg with Bruno or the iceberg itself, wherever you want to go with it, it's totally fine by me.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right to connect these girls to that lineage, and they're sort of the child star, the Hollywood child star. I mean, that would include, Shirley Temple and Jackie Coogan as well. I think the difference is, I guess, that Jackie Coogan appears with Charlie Chaplin and the kid, and Shirley Temple, becomes the main breadwinner for her family when she's 5 years old, and they tell her she's actually 3, and all this stuff kind of happens. But the difference is that they're performing in these kind of family friendly plots. And what I find fascinating about these little rock girls is that they're in these spaces where it's supposed to be about, sticking it to the man, but like daddy handed you your guitar, right? So like it's that interests me a lot. And that does feel like a distinction. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but it does feel like a distinction. And I guess it's kind of significant in that regard that Bruno Mars isn't, has, to my knowledge of his catalog, has never really presented himself as a kind of rebel rocker, insurgent kind of guy. Am I right about that? I could be wrong.
I'm not sure I know the full answer to that. I mean, I think that would be part of the questioning process. Like I said, I think Bruno's always in pop genius ways, sort of in between categories.
Yeah.
Can I just interject that I did just hear an interview with Anderson .Paak, who just started a new record label, who's in that group, Silk Sonic with Bruno, in which he vehemently said that his new record label will only sign artists who can perform their instruments live. And I feel like that's a connection back to this earlier era, similar to kind of what you're getting at with Bruno. There.
Interesting.
And they're definitely all about the throwback,
Yeah, interesting.
All right, Lucretia, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hey, can you hear me okay? I've got like a zillion questions. First of all, thank you both. This is so awesome. I love this. I wish I had been on time. Okay, so one thing I just have to say right away is I'm kind of angry when I hear like all these punk or punk feminist groups and these mainstream TV shows and commercials. Like there's this part of me that just feels like crying. Like what's happened? But then as I'm listening to you all talk and thinking it through, and then I was thinking it through last night when I heard some song on a commercial, I thought, well, maybe it means that we're moving closer towards equality. Maybe we're not being, maybe our punk and radical drives aren't being ruined. Maybe our culture is getting closer to what that music originally wanted. So I wanted to ask you both what you think of that. What do you think?
Well, I guess I'll go first because my mic's already on. I feel like rock as the sort of the emblem of youth music and youth rebellion is kind of done now. Certainly my teenagers don't listen to rock music at all, right? And my students, I don't know about any of the rest of you, but my students who are interested in kind of throwback music, they want to listen to like the Eagles and, Fleetwood Mac and like all these kind of gentle, so, and I don't know what that's about. I've been sort of speculating. I probably shouldn't even say this publicly because it's not even half baked, but I'm wondering if that is a kind of discomfort with like white men being angry, that like they're just that's sort of cringe now and sort of wanting to like that. I mean, they want to hear angry music, but they're not going to look to rock for that. So I do feel like the punk feminist thing, as much as I loved it too, continue to love it, is kind of a performance now, maybe for young people. I don't know. That's a bit half-baked. What do you think, Alexandra?
I feel like I want it to be genuine, but when I think Brian said like woke capitalism earlier, that's kind of where I go. But at the same time, maybe I'm just kind of being too optimistic. I also like to think that, people, if this means that more people are hearing, music that is kind of exciting and challenging, then I like to think that that's a good thing. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of on the fence. I'm maybe the wrong person to answer this question.
No, that's good. You're the right person to ask. Thank you both.
Okay, great. So Gail has, I think you have a couple questions. Maybe if there's one you can ask first.
Thank you. This is super fun. I guess I'd like to hear Jacqueline talk about girls rock camps and how that relates. And I also thought about Willow Smith as a and where she might fit into this conversation, actually into both conversations in a way. So, and I'll just mute myself now.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking a little bit at the chat, even though Eric told me not to. And I see a lot of people are talking about Girls Rock Camp, which is, I agree, absolutely central. And the Linda Lindas did their very first performance was at a girls' school. It's not exactly a rock camp, but it is a sort of Los Angeles event to kind of inspire girls and young women to participate in rock. So absolutely important. And Sarah Duger's work on this is really it shapes the way I think about these questions. So my daughter went to a girls' rock camp, and she wrote a song called "Girls to the Front," and it was like the proudest moment of my mothering life. She was like 10 years old. So I do think those organizations are really important and fascinating. Willow Smith is someone I have thought about. She's just kind of the wrong age to be part of what I'm talking about now in connection to the Linda Lindas. She's a little bit too old. So she's someone who I find really interesting as an artist, and thinking about her family does add another dimension that I'm not quite sure what to make of yet. So sorry, that's a bit of a cop out, but it's best I can do.
Okay. Antonia, I'm not sure if that was a question or more of a comment.
It was a question. I guess the basic question is what happened, or is there a pattern when people who are young musicians don't identify as kid musicians? Like Prince started really young, and I think he wouldn't have ever welcomed being seen as a kid musician. And Wendy and Lisa in the whole Prince universe, so folks who are accomplished musicians who start really young, they may not claim kid musicians. So what makes a difference?
Do you want me to take that one, Alexandra? Yeah.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a really interesting category. And you think about Prince and Michael Jackson, both born the same year, and like really not that far apart in terms of when they started their careers. But you're right, Prince was never presented as a child the way Michael Jackson was, right? So, and it can be really hard to outgrow that, right? It can be really hard to shake that off and establish an adult identity, and particularly for girls, because often the easiest way we allow girls to become women is through hypersexualization, right? So if you're not willing to do that, or if that's uncomfortable for any reason, it can be very difficult to make that leap to being taken seriously as an adult. And I think about singers too, like Adele was pretty young when she started releasing stuff, but she always kind of sounded like a middle-aged woman already, like kind of like a torch singer. I don't mean that in a nasty way, but she was always singing very kind of adult ballad material. And so I think she kind of sidestepped that whole moment of being the wrong age to sing her material. And I guess Prince did too, right? That right out of the gate, he was performing like an adult. I don't know if that helps, but a really interesting question.
Okay. Kira, do you want to ask your question now?
Cooking is still happening, but I'm not doing it. I wanted to kind of tie a couple of threads. I did a summer of Willie Mae Rock Camp in New York City about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And an observation I'm finding among, maybe it's COVID, I don't know, but my thing about the girls' voice is the political voice, both in the music and tech realm or user-generated contexts, gets so co-opted. And the research that says that when girls reach age 9, they often lose their voice. I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about this kind of adultification and the kidultization that's happening around them in the music industry, and the lack of representation in spaces where the power lives in the industry. I say this because when I did the Willie Mae Rock Camp for Girls, which, really, really is forwarding a queer, non-binary, open space, and how I just don't see, maybe Willow is probably the exception for me, Willow Smith. I don't see a lot of, I see a lot of reinscribing of heteronormativity in a lot of ways. And so I just wonder what you think, even in the daddy-daughter type stuff as well.
Alexandra, do you want to speak to that?
I love that question a lot. And I think, I love the question, but I don't love what you're seeing, which I think is also what I see. And I think, yeah, it's the question of who ultimately kind of controls the representation. And, with the singers I look at in the 60s, those questions are so thorny and difficult because, I think on one hand, I always want to elevate and celebrate instances of girls having these opportunities to express themselves, and whether that's musically or otherwise. But I also feel like it's so hard to tease out like the extent to which that is theirs and the extent to which that is, someone else's, particularly in kind of 60s music, when we, know that there's a lot of kind of not just 60s music, but there's a lot of kind of infrastructure pushing people to do certain things. And I think like that's a challenge that I think about a lot as someone who's trying to think about this kind of music from a feminist perspective. Like how do we tease out, where the agency is? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add to that again, thinking about children specifically, that, up to a point, all children's play is derivative, right? Like it's all kind of repetitious of stuff that's gone before. It's all recreation. So like in the classical music world, there's tons of like little baby violin virtuosi and pianists and whatnot, but we don't see them in the experimental music scene, right? Because like, how would we even know if they're any good or not, right? Like if we don't recognize the repertoire they're playing. So it's always stuff that's been kind of handed to them. And that's okay, right? And through recreating stuff and finding your own ways to participate, whether it's through rock camp or orchestra or whatever, that's how the children, I guess, develop their own voice. So I guess I'm maybe less concerned about the lack of originality when we're looking at really children's performances, because I think that has to come a little bit later. Absolutely, I want to sort of look at this through a feminist lens and look for opportunities for children to express, non-conventional, non-heteronormative identities. And it's hard, but yeah, you're right. There isn't a lot of it out there. There isn't a lot to see there. Sorry, my phone's chirping at me. I don't know if you can all hear that. Yeah, so that is something we have to look for carefully.
Okay, great, thank you. Gus, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks so much for the talks. And this is kind of a basic and possibly ill-informed question, but for Alexandra, I'm just struck by how in Britain there seems to be so much less of like a girl group tradition. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have about why that might be. I'm sure that there are material explanations. I know the acts that you're talking about are sort of after the golden age of the girl group. So I don't know if that's just, the answer, but on the other hand, I'm just kind of curious also if like, did they see those older American girl groups as their like kind of, ancestors?
I have lots of theories about these questions, if not like a specific answer. So they did overlap with the girl groups fairly significantly. So the Supremes and the kind of Motown crowd were touring the UK in like 64, 65, kind of at about the same time that a lot of these singers were kind of getting their start. My theories about why we do see more kind of solo singers rather than girl groups are kind of twofold. First of all, I think that the kind of group singer, the group of singers model in Britain, you saw more of that kind of in like years prior to the 60s, particularly associated with kind of music hall acts. And so I think that there is some kind of like idea that that is kind of more old fashioned and that the sort of like solo girl kind of represents something newer and something modern in the 60s. And I think the like plethora of stories about, you know, girls going off on their own to London to kind of find their way in the world, which was also tied to these ideas about like what it meant to be kind of young and modern at that time, are part of that. And then I think the other piece of this kind of maybe comes back to these attitudes that, you know, girl singers had to be each other's competitors rather than allies. I think that there's a piece of that that's feeding into this too by the time we get to the 60s. So yeah, like I said, these are kind of like theories that I have kind of been toying with for a while. But yeah.
Great. Okay. Evelyn, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thanks. This is a great conversation. Thanks to everybody. So Jacqueline, you know, one of the things that you write about in your Amazing Girl Groups book is about how there is always a question of a kind of inauthenticity and a performativeness to those late 50s, early 60s girl groups, and that they were always being coached by somebody, right? I mean, weren't just able to emerge from their bedrooms and have full agency of who they were. And you really value that. You say that's part of being a girl, and you know, it's part of that notion that we have to put on an image, and we're, you know, but I feel like you, like with the Lindas, you aren't valuing that. You seem to have a more like judgmental attitude. So do you feel like the times have changed, or what's the difference?
Well, I'm sorry if I seem judgmental, because I do think they're tremendous, and I do value their performance of I do value their performance of rage, right? I think that's incredibly valuable, and they do a terrific job of it. So I'm glad you brought this up and gave me the chance to clarify. No, I don't mean to sound cynical about them. I do want to draw attention to the fact that, you know, there's lots of genuinely angry little girls out there with lots to say, and they don't all get the kind of opportunities that this group has had, right? And so we need to be I guess there is I see a certain degree of fetishization of that group, of like, oh, how original, how special and unique they are, and you know, and I guess I just want us to think like that might not actually be true, right? It's just that they've got this platform and they're able to navigate the system better than others. But I mean, I can remember feeling very, very angry a lot of the time when I was around that age. And I don't think that was, you know, unusual. So yeah, does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah, no, I think that does clarify it, because I felt like I do think that, yes, I think it was shocking to a lot of us to all of a sudden see something like that go viral. But I mean, I don't want to discount what they're doing and their intentions, and I'm glad to hear that you don't just write off that, because I think has come out of girls rap camp. There's been a lot of other girls like that before, and they're just the ones to sort of, you know, really get our attention. Strangely, with the library, no allowed performance, so it is all very weird.
And of course, that's part of it too, right? That they're in a library just adds to the kind of the sassiness of it all, I think. But yeah, so I think it is easy to sort of trivialize and dismiss angry little girls as just like cute and not non-threatening, but also I feel like there is something real there that you know, and I'm delighted that those girls got a chance to say it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Is it Leaf? Would you like to?
It is.
Excellent.
It is. Okay, so what I typed in the question box was kind of a fortune telling question, and you are not fortune tellers. So you probably cannot say. So the question I had was, so there's a lot of public discourse right now about like the Free Britney movement and the things that Britney and her compatriots, like in the same sort of early 90s time frame, endured, right? And what I had asked in the chat was if you think that this public conversation will lead to changes in the future, but you can't answer that because you don't really know. So I guess what I'm really asking is, like, is this kind of the first time that this conversation has happened, or is this like the cycle just going around again? Like, have we had this conversation before?
I think so. Yeah. Sorry. Anne, what do you think? I feel like that this is, I feel like we're constantly rediscovering like women in rock and girls in rock. Like, oh, look, I feel like that happens every few years since the 80s.
Have we had this conversation about like the explicit damage that it causes though? Like in a really public way?
First of all, I'm really happy that you're here, Leith. It's lovely to see you. I think we've seen this with like Ronnie Spector kind of going very public about what happened in her relationship with Phil Spector. She now does a sort of one-woman show where she kind of narrates episodes from like reading from her memoir about that experience, and then like sings songs from the 60s kind of like interspersed with that. I think we saw something like this with the Kesha scenario a few years ago. I don't know. I think what's interesting about it, and also with Marianne Faithfull, and I think what's interesting about it is that it sometimes gets positioned as a way for, it's like a route that some of these singers end up having to like reinvent themselves as singers too. So again, it's that story of like, you were a girl singer who was a pop singer who was not worthy of being taken seriously as a musician. Then we learned that that wasn't your true self. And now you have reinvented yourself as a kind of like honest and authentic performer. And so now we can take you seriously. So I think what I find alarming about that is that it's almost like the harm has to happen for these singers to be respected. And that upsets me. So,
yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, Kirsten, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I guess this kind of gets back to maybe Jacqueline's suggestion, regarding how the culture industry wants real children to perform. I think you put it like that. The culture industry wants real children to perform so that we can, I think you said, awaken our inner child or something like that. And so then I was thinking about, what it is that we like about seeing children perform. The voice, the singing contests, the virtuosos, etc. And I was just wondering about when girls perform not with their childlike voice, but in fact with a supremely mature voice. And they're singing these really established sort of 19th century arias that are, technically virtuosic, very difficult to sing. And then they have this kind of maturity that they're trying to emulate in their voice, which is actually apparently very damaging to them. And then the song content, of course, can also overlap. It's not punk rock, it's not, but nevertheless, it is material that may be construed as inappropriate for a 9-year-old to sing. So I just wondered a little bit about that, what it is that why do we like that too? I mean, what makes that also successful? And is it just simply the juxtaposition of, the child singing with the adult voice versus the adult content? But I don't know.
Alexandra, you told me we should talk about Jackie Ivanko, and I see you were right. So she's one of these baby opera singers. For those of you that don't know her work, and yeah, I mean, Alexandra, do you want to speak to that, because it is, you're right, it is that a very similar kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about, there was a singer on, not an opera singer, but there was a singer on America's Got Talent a few years ago who, I think she was about 14, and she basically was a James Brown impersonator. And so she would come on stage and she sounded like James Brown. It was really bizarre and unsettling. So a young white woman. And so I don't know, I think that there's some kind of, it's in a way, it's that sort of uncanny appeal of the kind of mismatched voice and mismatched body that I think people find kind of like interesting and unusual to behold. I think there's like a piece of that going on there. But then, yeah, it is, it's hard to sustain. It's, if you're using your voice to that extent at such a young age, that's it, without a lot of kind of care and training, that can be something that's hard to sustain.
It is the kind of the uncanny valley thing, isn't it? Right? Like the cuteness of the child and the difficulty and maturity of the material. And we like it, the further apart that is, the more we like it, until it gets too far apart and we're like, oh God, no, that's too much. It's repulsive, right? So yeah, and it is interesting to navigate that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, I think that's it. This has been an amazing conversation. And thank you so much to Jacqueline and Alexandra for coming here and talking to us. We are taking a break next week, but I hope that you will join us on November 22nd, when Alexandra Reed and Craig Seymour will be here to talk about the best of the 80s. Good night.